Pulmonary and cardiac plexuses, right, the anatomy of. They're lumped together because they're so close together, it's really difficult to tell which is which, and that's kind of the point. I mean, what do you really need to know? You need to know where they are, what they do, how they're formed. Plexuses can be complicated, so I'm going to make it simple, or try to. First things first, what do we mean by a plexus? Right, well, we're talking about nerves. Really, we're talking about neurons. So a neuron is a cell of the nervous system that has a cell body and a very long axon. Well, sometimes they have very short axons. But in terms of what we're thinking about today is a neuron is attached to the central nervous system somewhere. And that neuron is then going to plug into a part of the body somewhere. And the neuron, it can send an action potential, a signal, only in one direction. So neurons are all one way, which means they're either motor, they're driving something, muscle, or they're sensory, they're collecting sensory information from, say, a pressure sensor in the skin and taking it back to the central nervous system. And these neurons, well, their axons in a peripheral nerve could be a micron in diameter, or 10 microns, or a bit bigger or a bit smaller, something like that. So a nerve, a peripheral nerve, is a bundle of hundreds or thousands of neurons doing this job. And a plexus then is cable management. So these neurons are going from the central nervous system to structures in the body. If they're all going to the same place, bundle them all together, it's a nerve, right? Factor in then the complexity of the body, and then we have lots of neurons forming lots of nerves, which are going to be mixed motor and sensory. They're going to do different jobs. Some of them are going to be going to the same places, some of them are going to be going to different places. So as they follow those paths, they're going to overlap and cross with other nerves, meet up with other bundles of neurons, join those together, and off they go to the heart or the lungs. That's a plexus. When we have nerves coming from different places, on their way to similar places, they meet up, they cross over, they form new nerves that then all run out to whatever target they're going to. Does that make sense? The most important idea then is a plexus is where nerves cross over. There are no synapses here, there are no connections. This is just cable management. This is just cable ties, bundling your cables together to get them from multiple places to other places. The pulmonary plexus then is this plexus of nerves that are going to go to the lungs, and the cardiac plexus is this plexus of nerves that are going to go to the heart, and the lungs and the heart are right next to each other. Here's the sternum. Let's take the rib cage off, and we see the heart. So the heart, some major things to point out. There's the pulmonary trunk. There's the aorta. The aorta is going to arch around and send off these branches. And if I take the heart out, so we're looking posterior to the heart, we can see we're between the lungs now. There's the left main bronchus and the right main bronchus, and the trachea is up there. So the arch of the aorta is up against the trachea where it bifurcates. This is where we're going to find these plexuses. Now the lungs and the heart are organs, they are viscera. They're not somatic, they're not things we're aware of. I mean, sure, we can breathe in and out using your diaphragm, but you can't control the rate of your heart. Okay, so that means that they're innervated by the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system has sympathetic and parasympathetic parts. And also we have visceral afferents, that is sensory nerves running from the viscera back to the central nervous system. So those are the nerves that are going to be innervating these organs. If we take the pulmonary plexus first, what do the lungs need? Well, we have the airway, we have lots of blood vessels. So the airway has got smooth muscle in it. So the smooth muscle is going to need nerves to control when it contracts and when it relaxes. The blood vessels have also got smooth muscle in them, particularly arteries and arterioles. So they're going to need nerves to innervate them to tell them when to constrict and dilate to control the flow of blood through these organs. The cells inside the airway secrete a mucus as part of the mucociliary escalator. I mean, partly the inside of the airway needs to be moist for gaseous exchange to occur. It also needs to be moist to protect the cells here because it's an external surface inside us and we're breathing air in. But in terms of the mucociliary escalator, the mucus collects dust and particles and then the cilia lift those particles out of the airway and you cough them up. It's a way of keeping the airway clean. So we have glands in here, so we need to tell those glands to secrete mucus. So those are the motor side of things. Also, we have sensory things, don't we? So we have stretch receptors in the lungs, which are part of that automatic mechanism of breathing in and out. So we have stretch receptors. There are other receptors inside the airway which respond to irritants, which cause a cough reflex, right? So again, protecting the airway, making you cough. And then there are also chemoreceptors in there. Okay, so there are a number of motor neurons going in to innervate smooth muscle and the mucus secreting glands, and there are a number of sensory neurons coming back out again. So we've got quite a bit of work to do. I've got another model with nerves on. Okay, lungs, heart. I'll take the lungs off so we can see what we want to see. And again, from the heart, we've got the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Now, what you can see on this model is you can see we've got nerves everywhere. And this is what we see. So we see nerves following the blood vessels, well, some of them. So we need to get sympathetic nerves and parasympathetic nerves to the lungs and visceral afferents from the lungs, those sensory nerves. And what we find is here, you may have seen this before, this is the sympathetic trunk, the sympathetic chain, these are the sympathetic ganglia. The sympathetic nerves come out of the thoracic spinal cord and a little bit of lumbar spinal cord. And we have sympathetic nerves coming out of the spinal cord, running to these sympathetic ganglia and synapsing. So a ganglia is where you have cell bodies, where you have connections. So they'll do a number of things here, but some of them are going to synapse and then run from the sympathetic trunk to the pulmonary plexus. Now, where's the pulmonary plexus? Well, the hilum of the lung, that bit there, that's the only place things can get in and out of the lung. Blood vessels, airway, nerves, lymphatics, they have to go in and out through the hilum of the lung. And the nerves, we said, they are going to innervate the smooth muscle of the bronchi, and they're going to carry sensory information back from the inside of the airway, and they're going to innervate the mucus glands and all those sorts of things, right? Which means that we're going to find the pulmonary plexus upon the two main bronchi. So here's the trachea, and it divides into the left main bronchus and the right main bronchus, and it's here that we will see nerves, little fine nerves covering the airway and going into the lung, and that is the pulmonary plexus. We can divide it into two parts. The anterior pulmonary plexus is on the anterior side of the hilum. The posterior pulmonary plexus is on the posterior side of the hilum. But you get the idea. We have lots of different nerves doing different jobs. Sympathetic, parasympathetic, sensory. So they're coming from different places. And then they're going to go to the lung. So they all have to converge here at the hilum of the lung. And then they go into the lung. And then they branch off and go to the different places. But where they meet and converge and overlap, that is the pulmonary plexus. So the sympathetic nerves supplying the lungs that are going to the pulmonary plexus are going to come from levels T1 to T6. Sympathetic nerves at those levels will find their way to the pulmonary plexus. And the other one is this guy here. Here's the vagus. So this is the esophagus. The nerve running on either side here is the vagus nerve, And the vagus nerve is a cranial nerve, so the vagus nerve is coming out of the brainstem and it's carrying parasympathetic innervation down from the brainstem to the thorax and to the abdomen. So the sympathetic nerves come out of the spinal cord at thoracic levels. The vagus nerve carries parasympathetic nerves down into the thorax, and just you can see how the esophagus is right next to the trachea, the vagus is running with the esophagus, and on the other side we've got the arch of the aorta there, which I've taken off, but you get the gist. There's the vagus nerve there running around the arch of the aorta, and if I take that off again, you can see how the vagus nerve, the left and right vagus nerves, are right next to the trachea and the two main bronchi. So it's easy to imagine how the vagus nerve is going to send branches to the pulmonary plexus. Now, the visceral afferent fibers, the sensory neurons, their axons could go back either way. So some of them will run with the vagus nerve up to the brainstem, and some of them will run with sympathetic nerves into the spinal cord and then up to the brainstem. And that sensory information will be relayed to parts of the brain. Parasympathetic innervation will cause bronchoconstriction. It'll cause secretion of those mucus-secreting glands. And there actually isn't a lot of sympathetic innervation to the smooth muscle in the bronchioles in humans, unlike some other mammals. And all that sensory information will go back to the centers in the brain that regulate the rate at which you breathe, so you don't have to think about breathing. Although now that I've said it, you are thinking about breathing, because that's how it works. Anyway, that's the pulmonary plexus. So I described that first because that's the deepest bit. Now the cardiac plexus is going to send those same fibers, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and visceral afferent fibers, to and from the heart. And they're right next to each other, right? So what does the heart need? Okay, so it needs to know whether to contract faster or contract more slowly. It needs to know whether it should contract more forcefully or less forcefully. It needs pressure sensors. It needs pain sensors. Oh, and the coronary arteries. You can change the amount of blood that flows through the coronary arteries as well. So again, you've got that vasodilation, vasoconstriction issue with the coronary artery supplying blood to the muscle of the heart, right? So where is the cardiac plexus? The cardiac plexus, well, it's got deep and superficial parts. But if I put this back on, so there's the arch of the aorta there. You can see the vagus nerve there. This is the left pulmonary artery going out that way. This is the right pulmonary artery coming out that way. If I take this off again, do you see what I mean? So the pulmonary trunk is here. Then we have left, and right pulmonary arteries, right? So there's the right pulmonary artery there. There's the arch of the aorta. There's the trachea. So when you put all this together, we're in quite a compact space. So the superficial cardiac plexus is inferior to the arch of the aorta and anterior to the right pulmonary artery. So it's in there. And then the deep cardiac plexus is anterior to the trachea where it bifurcates and posterior to the arch of the aorta. So it's there. So if I put that back together, so right in there, which is why it's difficult to see, and the concept is so much more important. And look how we're a little bit left-sided here. So that superficial cardiac plexus then is mostly, predominantly, entirely taking fibers from the left vagus nerve and the left sympathetic trunk. The deep cardiac plexus then being very central is receiving sympathetic nerves from both sides and branches of the vagus nerve from both sides. And you might read about cardiac nerves or cardiac branches, and that's what they're talking about. There are cardiac branches from the vagus nerve running around the trachea to get to the cardiac plexus. And also there are, so we've got like cervical sympathetic ganglia. They'll send an inferior cardiac nerve down. So if you read about cardiac nerves, they're running from the sympathetic chain or the vagus to the cardiac plexus. That's all that is. So they're running across this space here. And again, the parasympathetic nerves of the cardiac plexuses then are coming from the vagus nerves, and the sympathetic nerves for the cardiac plexuses or the cardiac plexus are coming from spinal levels T1 to T4 mostly, a little bit of T5 is how it's usually described. Those two, the superficial and deep cardiac plexuses that you can think of as a single cardiac plexus is then sending fibers into and around the heart, to the sinoatrial node, along the coronary arteries, to the heart muscle, carrying visceral fibers back again. And again, the sensory fibers, the visceral afferent fibers from the heart, they can take either route. They might go with the sympathetic nerves back to the spinal cord, and that's important when we consider referred pain from the heart. And some of those sensory fibers will run with the vagus nerve back up to the brainstem. And as I said, the cardiac plexus and the pulmonary plexus themselves are intermingled. It's just cable ties. It's just neurons going from somewhere to get to similar places. They all overlap. They get bundled together, they form new nerves, and they go to do what they've got to do, right? That sympathetic innervation will increase the rate at which the heart contracts. Sympathetic innervation will increase the force of contraction. It will also cause dilation of the coronary arteries, so more blood flows to the heart muscle. And parasympathetic innervation will do the opposite. Those sensory fibers will carry sensory information back to the brainstem, so that those circuits in the brainstem can manage blood pressure and all that sort of clever stuff. Okay, what about referred pain then? Well, if a coronary artery becomes occluded or a branch becomes occluded and blood flow to the muscle of the heart is reduced and that heart muscle becomes ischemic, pain receptors send noxious stimuli back to the central nervous system. Pain. So the neurons carrying pain from the myocardium they take the same route back to the spinal cord that the sympathetic nerves take often. So they're entering the spinal cord at levels T1, T2, T3, T4. And that noxious stimulus entering the spinal cord at that level is not something that the brain is used to. It's not used to perceiving pain from organs. It's used to perceiving somatic sensation from the skin and the muscles and that sort of thing, right? So there seems to be some confusion. Although the pain is in here, the brain perceives that pain as coming from the chest wall, the upper back, the left side of the neck, and it might radiate to the left shoulder, the left arm, and that sort of thing. Remember how we said that the superficial cardiac plexus, for example, is a little bit lefty. Anyway, this isn't going to be the whole story. This isn't entirely understood, but this seems to be, the current best explanation for referred pain. The pain is here. The brain perceives it as coming from somewhere a little bit further away because the neurons enter the spinal cord. You're not used to sensing that pain, so it works it out as best it can. But anyway, right, so the pulmonary plexus, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and visceral afferent fibers, sensory fibers, supplying the lungs. So we find the pulmonary plexus then around the bronchi, the cardiac plexus, same nerves, doing similar things in the heart, and then we find them in a similar place. The cardiac plexus then is between the trachea and the posterior heart, the right pulmonary artery, the aortic arch. It's in there. and sends fibres off into the heart. I hope that was useful. Difficult to point at, so difficult to also dissect, so the concept is the most important part. Obviously, if things go wrong with those nerves, things go wrong with the heart, which is bad, or go wrong with the lungs. Right, see you next week.